Morning, everyone. First thing I have to say is that I'm a PowerPointaholic. If I were to even put one slide up this morning, I would fall right off the wagon, and they would probably have to carry me off the podium 20 minutes later, drunk in PowerPoint slides. So I'm here PowerPointless, and I take it one day at a time. But hopefully I won't be completely powerless or pointless in what I have to say. I also wanted not to put off congratulating the IAIA for taking on this topic in such a aggressive manner and for demonstrating such leadership, which is in such short supply on the climate change issue these days, it would seem. It's impossible to underestimate the importance of bodies of professionals such as yourselves coming to your own opinions and your own perspectives on this pervasive issue of climate change. And it happens in meetings like this that happen because of the leadership of the people in the IAIA. That's not hard to say, easy to say quickly, is it? Make this happen. And I'm a Canadian. A should come easily to me. My job, I was told, was to set the stage, and I had a little bit of a background in amateur theater and, they're the people that come out all dressed in black before the house lights come up and get all the sets and props in order before the lights come up and the real show begins. So I take some comfort in the fact that my job is really just to set the stage and not to try and actually put the show on that will follow with the presentations after mine that will go into more specifics than I intend to. We're talking, as was already mentioned, the theme is the private sector and climate change and impact assessment, and I'm glad that we already had the comment about the amorphous nature of the private sector, which certainly in its narrow sense is not really represented in this meeting or to a significant degree even in this panel. The credential that was mentioned in introducing me was actually quite a long ago affiliation I had with the United Nations University and the International Development Research Center. But more recently I've been working as managing director of a Chicago-based consulting firm that has among its clientele most of the large electric utilities in the United States, and prior to that as vice president for a Washington-based consulting firm, which is probably the largest climate change-related consultancy in the United States. Prior to that, I ran my own company for about 25 years, and my history on this issue goes back to 1988 when I helped to organize the energy workshop at a conference that was held in Toronto that year called the Toronto Conference on the Changing Atmosphere, which stands as something of a milestone in the emergence of climate change as a public policy issue. So that's the history and the experience that I bring to this question or this theme of the private sector and climate change and environmental impact assessment. I was at a dinner party the other night, and I was sitting beside a fellow I didn't know before I sat down beside him. And in getting to know him, I mentioned I was coming here today, and he was an investment portfolio manager. And I've noticed in conversations with them that they're always looking for things that might help them pick winners and losers in the market. And he asked me a question that I had actually been asked before by an investment portfolio manager, which was, what are the three most important things that are going on in climate change today? And I said, well, the first observation I would make is the hardening of the climate science over the last number of years. It just seems to go in one direction, as we saw so eloquently summarized yesterday morning by Bob Watson. And yet, even as that is going on, we see over the past 2 years a dramatic decline in the perceived threat of climate change in public opinion polling all over the world, by the way, not just here in the United States. It's an international trend that really started to take off after the failure of the Copenhagen meeting, in which we've seen the priority that is assigned to climate change as an issue of concern in public opinion polls drop quite precipitously. Even more so in the U.S. and in some other places where we're also witnessing, and I think it's related, the growth of an outright rejection of the facts and the science and even a rational approach to the issue. The second thing that one can't help but put on a short list of recent events in the climate change sphere is the failure of the United States to achieve the reversal in American climate response policy that was almost universally expected under the Obama administration and the Democratic Congress. There was a sense of palpable expectation 2 years ago this month after that presidential election that within the climate change policy community, finally the Americans were coming to the table. And it didn't happen. And that, I suppose, leads to the third observation of significant events that are part of the stage that needs to be set in talking about not just the private sector, but responses in general to climate change. And that, of course, is I don't know what else to call it, the train wreck that is known as the Copenhagen Conference that happened last December, where we saw years and years of efforts that were culminating, or were supposed to have culminated at that meeting, in a binding international agreement of some sort that would see international law begin to take shape around emission reduction regimes. It didn't happen. It's not expected to happen in Cancun either. So, three pretty negative comments on where we are at right now on this issue. I don't think that the outlook is totally bleak. In fact, one of the things that this series of setbacks has done is triggered what I think is some very healthy reconsideration of the frameworks and the approaches that both business and government are bringing to the climate change issue. And if that reconsideration that's going on, and it seems, for me at least, hardly a day goes by when I don't get a paper or an article or notice of a conference that has the word reconsideration or reevaluation or reframing in the title. If that leads to a more effective approach to the human response to climate change, then even these setbacks we may look back on them as having contributed to the necessary change in direction that was needed to get us out of the stall or the horse latitudes on climate change that we seem to have reached. I want to say a little bit, again, these are contextual, setting the stage type remarks, and I'm not part of your community, so I throw them out there not knowing if they will land hardly or softly or at all. But I think it's always important to have in the back of our minds, at least when thinking about climate change, what we're up against in terms of the necessary long-term response, notwithstanding the adaptation initiatives, which are now a necessary and inevitable part and growing part of the picture. It does not mean that we will not, it doesn't mean that we're off the hook, if you like, in terms of having to figure out how to devise and build a sustainable society, to devise and build firms and communities and national economies which operate in sustainable ways, including with respect to their energy systems. We still have to do that. It's just going to be tougher the longer we put off getting on with it, because the longer we put off getting on with it, as those of us who were there in '98 can appreciate, the more resources get diverted from achieving those solutions and toward coping with the consequences of delay. When I say that it's important to keep in mind what we're up against what I think is still the prevailing development paradigm in the world, which is a fossil fuel-based, fuel and electricity-based vision of how to achieve economic and social development. We've been working at this for 100 years now. We've been working at it with a vengeance since World War II. When I first got involved in this field in the mid-1970s, it was an absolute article of faith within the business community, within the energy policy community, within the economic development community, that human development meant gross domestic product had to grow, and the only way that gross domestic product could grow would be if there was also corresponding growth in the production and consumption of fuels and electricity. It was pretty well that simple. And businesses would make their investment strategies based on what in retrospect now look like very simple-minded correlations between projections of economic growth and the need for more power plants and more oil mega projects and more natural gas developments. And that paradigm ruled, and I would argue, notwithstanding the growing strength of countervailing developmental paradigms, the fossil fuel paradigm with all of its associated political and financial and business and logistical power and infrastructure is still the prevailing paradigm in the world. It's what the Western government policies of the 1950s, 60s, and 60s and 70s strive to maintain, and it's what the policies of the poor nations attempted and continue to attempt to emulate by and large, I would argue. That's the context into which the climate change debate needs to be placed.